Ask the dust on the road. Ask the Joshua tree standing alone where the Mojave Desert begins. Ask them about Camila Lopez, and they will whisper her name. The girl is gone. I was in love with her, and she hated me. And that is my story. It was 5 months ago, the day I got to town by bus from Colorado, with $150 in my pocket, a typewriter, and big plans in my head. I was 20 then. What the hell, I used to say. Take your time, Bandini. You got 10 years to write a book, so take it easy and learn about life. Why? My God, man, you realize you never had an experience with a woman? How can you write about life when you've never had a woman? Afraid of a woman? Great writer, this. Oh, you lousy fake, you phony. No wonder you can't write. Get out. Walk the streets.
I first ran into Ask the Dust back in 1972. I was working on the screenplay of Chinatown, and I was having a hell of a time. And what I was looking for at the time was a book or some document where I could get a sense of the way people talked in the 1930s, other than secondhand sources that I'd already run into. And everything that I'd read up to that point, I just didn't believe. I didn't believe that it was the way they talked, certainly not out here in California. And I was in this friend of mine's house who was an older man, and saw a book on the shelf called Ask the Dust. I asked him about it, and he said, it's written by a friend of mine, screenwriter, wrote Full of Life. He wrote that book, Ask the Dust. I said, what's it like? He said, I think it's kind of interesting. And I said, would you mind if I looked at it? And I picked it up and I started to read it. And right away, it just came to life. It had an immediacy that just threw me back into the 1930s. And I knew, the way you know those things, that was exactly how young people talked at that time, without any literary convention. This was a guy who had a distinctive voice, and you knew he was very good at capturing his own voice. And I went home, I finished it, and I was enthralled with it, way beyond my interest in the diction and the use of language for Chinatown. So I immediately thought, and of it itself would make a wonderful movie.
I call my book Ask the Dust because the dust of the East and the Middle West is in these streets. And it is a dust where nothing will grow, supporting a culture without roots and the empty fury of a lost, hopeless people, frenzied to reach a peace that cannot ever belong to them. Do I speak like a lunatic? Ask the dusty halls. Ask the dusty lobby. Ask the dusty people in the dusty lobby of the St. Paul. So many are already dust, but some there are who remember the great writer.
John was a very short man. He couldn't have been much more than 5'1" or 5'2", and very feisty and very suspicious. What are you interested in this book for? And who the hell are you? And why should I think that you'd have any interest in this at all? And I bore his kind of suspiciousness and that kind of cantankerous quality that is in the character of Arturo Bandini. It really was right out of John's mouth. Clearly I was talking to Bandini, there was just no doubt. There was just no question in my mind, none. So after we chatted a bit and he was convinced that I really meant what I said, he went to his bookshelf and he took out a first edition with a beautiful kind of old cover on it, with the old convertible car that was on the cover of the first edition. Sat down and wrote in the flyleaf, "To Bobtown, in the hope that he will take this to far places." And I guess I've been trying to take it to that place ever since. That was 1972, and I hope sometime this next year we're going to finally get that movie made. Anyway.
I, John Fante and Arturo Bandini, 2 in 1, friend of man and beast alike. I wandered these streets and sucked them up and the people in them like a man made of blotter paper. But look, let me try to tell you my story. I fell in love with this girl named Camila Lopez. I went into a cafe one night, and there she was. And ever after, even now, tonight, when I write about it, I choke when I think of the beauty of that girl. Soon I was so crazy in love I behaved like a fool, and all the time she loved somebody else. She loved a bartender in the Liberty Buffet where she worked, and the bartender couldn't stand her. So she went out with me to forget him. She went everywhere with me, and I was insane about her, and I got worse. And she got worse about the bartender. He couldn't bear her. He couldn't bear her because she was simply Mexican to him, and he was an American, and she was beneath him. Bandini is sympathetic with the girl because he understands how it is with this business of social prejudice. He is a writer. He is alone in Los Angeles.
I was very confused about John, though, when I met him. So he told wonderful stories. Some things were true and some things were not, and it was very hard to separate what had really happened to him from what he had envisioned had happened to him, because he would take the raw material of life and rework it into something much more meaningful. So sometimes he told you the real version, and sometimes he told you his hopped-up version. And when I noticed little discrepancies here and there, I thought, could I trust this man? And then I realized that he was a creative writer, and he was using raw material. John was Arturo Bandini. Arturo Bandini was John as he saw himself. If you read Ask the Dust, you will find this tremendous vision that he had of himself, how passionately he wanted to be a great writer.
Arturo Bandini, with one short story sold, great writer, dreaming about a book teeming with people, dusty, savage people, the real Los Angeles, Bunker Hill, that part of town below Figueroa, and Arturo Bandini dreaming of great days. The people who crossed his path. Marcus, the wine seller, who gave me a job as busboy because he thought I wrote serials for the Saturday Evening Post. Mrs. Adolph Lang with her pink fat breasts, which she offered me because she was the mother of God and I should partake of the milk of life. Dave Myers, the communist on the corner of 3rd and Hill, with his crippled leg, out of which he sold marijuana cigarettes. The hundreds of crummy lower 5th Street nightclubs, crammed with beautiful women. Girls writing home to Iowa and Indiana that they were clicking in the big town. Phooey, they were not clicking, they were fucking anybody and anything. Filipino and Jap and Negro in a place glutted with a plethora of beauty. Oh, those nightclubs where I learned to wander and idle.
When I was 24 years old, back in 1974, I was living in a room in Los Angeles trying to teach myself how to write. I had a hot plate and a mattress on the floor and my typewriter, and I was sort of blindly writing short stories. One day I read an article in the Los Angeles Times about this new film that had just come out called Chinatown. And I had seen the film and I'd really admired it. And I was interested to see when the screenwriter, Robert Towne, in talking about the research he did into 1930s Los Angeles, mentioned a novel I'd never heard before. This novel was called Ask the Dust, and Towne said that it was the best piece of fiction he'd ever read about Los Angeles. I was very intrigued because I'd never heard of it. I'd studied American literature at UCLA, and none of my professors had ever mentioned this guy, John Fante. And so I tracked down a copy of the original Stackpole Sons edition. I read it, and I was just astounded. I'd never read fiction that was so true and so honest, and I'd never read prose that sang so beautifully. And it spoke to me directly because Arturo Bandini is this young kid in Los Angeles trying to write, and I was this young kid in Los Angeles trying to write. And it was a truly magnificent moment when I read this novel.
I climbed out of the window and scaled the incline to the top of Bunker Hill. A night for my nose, a feast for my nose, smelling the stars, smelling the flowers, smelling the desert and the dust asleep across the top of Bunker Hill. The city will treat me gently. Not those girls of my childhood, those girls of my boyhood, those girls of my university days. They frightened me. They were diffident. They refused me. A girl appeared. "Hello, honey," she said, smiling as though Bandini were her lover or her husband. "How about it, honey? Want me to show you a good time?" Bold lover, bold and brazen Bandini. "Nah," he said. "No thanks, not tonight." When I saw a policeman strolling toward me, I walked away. It was a hot night. Sand from the Mojave had blown across the city. Tiny brown grains of sand clung to my fingertips whenever I touched anything, and when I got back to my room, I found the mechanism of my new typewriter glutted with sand. When I took off my clothes, it fell like powder to the floor. Lying in the darkness, the red light from the St. Paul Hotel flashing on and off across my bed was bluish now, a ghastly color, jumping into the room and out again.
When I was young and reading novels and short stories, they seemed always to take place in Connecticut or New York, or maybe Paris or London. I'd read very little, if anything, that took place in my own backyard, so to speak. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and suddenly here was my city, my hometown, brought to life in this novel. And it didn't matter that the Los Angeles of the novel is in the 1930s. It still was the soul of Los Angeles, a city where I think dreams and desire are built into the soul of the city.
I think everybody came to California in the hope of fulfilling some sort of dream. Robert Frost wrote a poem in which he said, and speaking of New England, that everyone in their time, to use a New England expression, would recognize that they would have to eat their peck of dirt, that life was that. And then the poem has a refrain, but in California, I was told, we all should have our peck of gold. And it was a search for that peck of gold.
The old folk, from Indiana and Iowa and Illinois, from Boston and Kansas City and Des Moines, they sold their homes and their stores, and they came here by train and by automobile to the land of sunshine to die in the sun. Smith and Jones and Parker, druggist, banker, baker, dust of Chicago and Cincinnati and Cleveland on their shoes, doomed to die in the sun, a few dollars in the bank, enough to keep alive the illusion that this was paradise, that their little papier-mâché homes were castles. These were my countrymen, These were the new Californians.
I don't know how a young man in his circumstances reinvents himself, as John did. He was very poor. He was beset with circumstances, heartbreaking sadness. His father had left, his mother was having a breakdown, the whole family had broken up. But he wrote, in spite of the fact that he was working hard at menial labor every day, he set himself 2 hours at night to write. I think he had a terrible compulsion to be somebody, to accomplish something, to do something. He couldn't stand being that poor and that despised. He couldn't stand being a hey you guy, as he used to say. Never be a hey you guy. It was his dislike for poverty and desperation that drove him to writing.
I know what you're thinking, Bandini. The thoughts of your father before you lash across your back, hot fire in your skull, that you are not to blame. This is your thought, that you were born poor, son of misery peasants, driven because you were poor, fled from your Colorado town because you were poor, rambling the gutters of Los Angeles because you are poor, hoping to write a book to get rich, because those who hated you back in Colorado will not hate you if you write a book. You are a coward, Bandini, a traitor to your soul, a feeble liar before your weeping Christ. This is why you write. This is why it would be better if you died.
It's kind of stranger in a strange land that everyone felt when they came to California. Everybody was from somewhere else. In leaving their roots and leaving places where they felt that they were mired hopelessly by their own history, and seeking to escape their own history, the desert and the psychological wasteland that they felt here yawned before them, and they felt even more lost, even more hopeless. In seeking to fulfill their dreams, they came to a place where it only pointed out to them that they could never fulfill their dreams.
Those huaraches, do you have to wear them, Camilla? Do you have to emphasize the fact that you always were and always will be a filthy little greaser? She looked at me in horror. Clasping both hands against her mouth, she rushed inside the saloon. I tossed my shoulders and swaggered away, whistling with pleasure. In the gutter, I saw a long cigarette butt. I picked it up without shame, lit it as I stood with one foot in the gutter. I was an American, and goddamn proud of it. This great city, these mighty pavements and proud buildings, they were the voice of my America. From sand and cactus, we Americans had carved an empire. Camilla's people had had their chance. They had failed. We Americans had turned the trick. Thank God for my country. Thank God I have been born an American.
It's a bit like an Apache dance, that French Apache dance where the couple, the man is wearing a beret, or is it the woman, who knows, and he's got the little scarf around his neck and the cigarette dangling from his lips, and the girl's in a tight sweater and tight skirt, and they're literally throwing each other around the cabaret as they dance. They practically beat the shit out of each other as they dance. Well, that's Camilla and Arturo for me, this kind of brutal courtship, which, at the grammar school level, if you really like the girl, you dip her pigtail in the inkwell, and she will insult you, and it's true love, At the level where the racism comes into it, both of them in their own way have been made to feel both ashamed of their respective origins. He is an Italian, she is a Mexican. And it's a little bit like the Groucho Marx line, anybody that will allow me to join their country club I wouldn't want to belong to. Anybody who is willing to love a wop like me or a spick like me is not worth being with. I mean, they are so, in the end, they're both proud, ferociously proud, and at the same time, deeply ashamed.
There was a feeling in Colorado, particularly, also in California, against Italians at that time. They were regarded as inferiors, and most of the Italians who came to America in those years were poverty-stricken, or they wouldn't have been here. I mean, the upper-class Italians didn't generally emigrate. So Italians were not highly regarded, and he felt hurt by that. Also, he went to a Jesuit school, and the priests were mostly Irish, and they called him Dago and Wop. Those were fighting words to John. He didn't like that. So he developed a permanently defensive approach to life.
You try so hard to be an American, I said. Why do you do that? Look at yourself. She went to the mirror, studied herself gravely. I'm tired, she said. We were busy tonight. It's those shoes, I said. You ought to wear what your feet were meant to wear, huaraches. And all that paint on your face. You look awful. A cheap imitation of an American. You look frowsy. If I were a Mexican, I'd knock your head off. You're a disgrace to your people. Who are you to talk like that, she said. I'm just as much an American as you are. Why, you're not an American at all. Look at your skin. You're dark like Italians. And your eyes, they're black. Brown, I said. They're not either. They're black. Look at your hair. Black. Brown, I said. She lit a cigarette and smoked it in silence, her stare at the ceiling, smoke tumbling from her nostrils in quiet agitation. I said, to me, you'll always be a sweet little peon, a flower girl from old Mexico.
Arturo Bandini is as much a racist as any American might have been in the 1930s. In The Road to Los Angeles, he is a thoroughgoing racist. He calls his co-workers at the Toyo fish cannery nigger, spick, slimy oriental, awful, horrible names. And he knows that those names will hurt. That's what he wants to do. The effect on Arturo, though, when he hurls out these awful names, is that he feels like a corpse. It's as if he's hurting himself too. He doesn't analyze it, but he feels it. He feels the effects of racist behavior. That's The Road to Los Angeles. In Ask the Dust, which takes up Arturo a couple of years later, he's now 20 or 21 rather than 18. He can get into some similar sort of shouting matches with Camilla, calling her a spick and making fun of her Mexican huaraches. But again, he feels remorse afterwards. And in the marvelous scene, it's in his room afterwards, he lies on his bed and thinks back to his days in Colorado, and those people, the Smiths and the Parkers and the Jones, those Coloradans who did the same thing to him. And he realizes now, in a way that he was not able to realize in The Road to Los Angeles, that he's wrong.
Camilla, when I was a kid back in Colorado, it was Smith and Parker and Jones who hurt me with their hideous names, who called me Wop and Dago and Greaser. And their children hurt me just as I hurt you. They hurt me so much I could never become one of them. Drove me to books, drove me within myself, drove me to run away from that Colorado town and into your home and your life. And sometimes, Camilla, when I see their faces out here, the same faces, the same set, hard mouths from my hometown, I'm glad they're here, fulfilling the emptiness of their lives and dying in the sun. I've vomited at their newspapers, read their literature, observed their customs, eaten their food, gaped at their art. But I am poor, and my name ends with a soft vowel, and they hate me and my father and my father's father, but they're old now, dying in the sun. And I am young and full of hope and love for my country and my times. And when I say Greaser to you, it is not my heart that speaks, but the quivering of an old wound, and I am ashamed of the terrible thing I've done. And that's racism. I wouldn't call that. You know, I mean, it's a man reaching at a very young age one of the great revelations of his life. Never again, one feels, will this young man be so full of hope and so full of despair, which is to say, never again will he be so full of feeling.
We lay there. She was forcing it with her scorn, the kiss she gave me, the hard curl of her lips, the mockery of her eyes, until I was like a man made of wood. And there was no feeling within me except terror and fear of her, a sense that her beauty was too much, that she was so much more beautiful than I, deeper rooted than I. She made me a stranger unto myself. She was all of those calm nights and tall eucalyptus trees, the desert stars, that land and sky, that fog outside. And I had come there with no purpose save to be a mere writer, to get money, to make a name for myself and all that piffle. She was so much finer than I, so much more honest, that I was sick of myself.
This is a first printing of Ask the Dust, published by Stackpole Sons in 1939, with an inscription to Esther, for Esther, with love and affection, signed John and John Fante. Esther Blaisdell was a girlfriend, a former girlfriend of Carrie McWilliams, John's best friend. And here we have an original copy of Dago Red, Fante's 1940 collection of short stories. In this, he's inscribed to Esther Blaisdell again, and it's an interesting inscription dated March 4th, 1945. For Esther, from that Hollywood whore, that stinking sellout artist, that sublime literary pervert, that aborted lyricist, that stinking scene artist, that paramount cunt-lapper who gets paid for the sweet-scented vomit whispered by Dorothy Lamour, dedicated with the hope that someday, soon, he can write some less bitter inscription on the flyleaf of a really great work. Love, John Fante. This captures, it seems to me, Fante's true attitude toward Hollywood screenwriting.
Dear Carrie, when I go broke, my agent in Hollywood can usually place me for a few weeks at one of the studios until they fire me, and I come away with enough to breathe easy. But it's a nerve-wracking, jittery existence, and in the last analysis, not worthwhile. The compromise becomes increasingly difficult. Hollywood is a bad place. It kills writers.
The sad thing was that he was basically a writer of novels, fiction. He always felt that he was going down in the world when he did motion pictures, and most of the time he was. The best screenplays he wrote were never made, sadly enough.
Life was hard for him. Even though he was making a lot of money in the movie business, he was just angry. You know, he was an angry guy. He was an artist, and he did not he did not take setbacks well, and he did not take disagreement and compromise well. He did not want to compromise, and that was his problem. And he didn't understand. Not only didn't he understand, but he didn't tolerate people who didn't appreciate good work. I mean, he would call, you know, he would curse at producers and call them names and call them a fool and illiterate. And it didn't bother him that he, when he had disagreement with somebody, he would just speak his mind. It was a terrible flaw politically for him, because he got himself in a lot of trouble with his mouth.
He was basically unhappy about life. He felt frustrated, always frustrated. He felt that he was never allowed to express himself fully. And so his basic mood was anger. However, that's an Italian characteristic. His father's basic mood was anger. It seems like a strange thing to say about somebody, but you knew he was angry the minute he entered the room. He was always angry. And it went up from being basically angry to being in a rage, and then back to the basic anger. John was a little bit like that.
A wonderful man, but combative, suspicious. You can see his father in him, full of pride and an injured merit, feeling that he deserved better and more recognition than he ever got. But who was hilarious about it. I mean, his bitterness was far too entertaining to be anything other than great fun to be around, and deservedly so. He never got the recognition that he deserved.
Carrie and I got awfully drunk and made the rounds. We ended up at a Negro joint in Wilshire District, and I was too tight to drive home. I stayed at a hotel and caught hell from Joyce the next morning when I got back here. I was too petered to work yesterday, but today I worked a couple of hours. I have quite a lot of material gathered for the Filipino book, but there is little of it I can use. I will not attempt the book until I get a very clear outline of the plot. The story of the Filipino in California has not been told, and I am going to tell it.
he has the ambition of writing a book that will be even better than Steinbeck's great novel of the 30s, Grapes of Wrath. Fante is going to write the novel which does for the Filipino migrant workers of California what Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath has done for American farmers in the 1930s. And he works on this novel very hard. He does all sorts of research, and he familiarizes himself with the world of the Filipino, the Pinoy lettuce picker, the asparagus worker, the melon picker.
The Little Brown Brothers will be a swashbuckling, romantic story of a proud little people kicked up and down this state under the most vicious system of race and class taboo that has ever existed. But I won't tell it that way. I'll make the little Filipino a hero. I understand them. I like them. I see them because I am Latin, and their tradition, if any, is Spanish and Latin too.
When Fante sent the manuscript of The Little Brown Brothers to New York, he had the highest hopes that this was going to be a great American masterpiece. And he waited with high anticipation for his editor's response. Well, when he got his editor's response, he was crushed because, in fact, his editor hated The Little Brown Brothers, the 100 pages or 96 pages that Fante had sent him. He thought that Fante had failed to capture the authentic truth of the Filipino experience, and that in fact at worst Fante had condescended, had written down to his subject material.
He had deep sympathy for them. He liked them. He thought that they shared the same kind of disadvantages that he had, only in a greater degree. And he felt they were very badly treated in California. They got a raw deal, and he was right. He wanted to write something beautiful about them, but it didn't turn out that way. I read it. It was an impossible book to write. Anything he wrote about Filipinos sounded like mockery. It sounded condescending. He didn't mean it to be, but no matter how he tried, it turned out that way, and so he dropped it.
I think one way to look at The Little Brown Brothers is as John Fante's imaginative meditation on American racial relations. He was clearly interested in envisioning a world in which the minority ethnicities, blacks, Filipinos, Chinese, Jews, somehow had a world in which they themselves could coexist. He revealed truths about American society that remain too true today, and that is that the fabric of this society is fraught with racial tensions. There is the black part of Los Angeles, there are the white parts of Los Angeles, there's Koreatown, there's the Central American section, and East LA all Mexican American. Fante clearly had a vision of the American ethnic experience in mind here that nobody else was even coming close to. And we'll never know what kind of novel he could have written had his editor allowed him to. Unfortunately, Fante took his editor's rejection to heart, and he spent the rest of the 1940s drinking, golfing, gambling, and writing screenplays which he hated. I think he was terribly hurt that this novel that he had such high hopes for had been summarily dismissed.
Dear Carrie, I am sick tonight, sick as hell. 2 nights running I have been drunk. The earth and men sadden me. I weep for the world. Men wandering the earth, men in their little houses with their little wives and their children hiding from the earth. Something is needed, some rush of excitement, some way of warding off death. Fight fire with fire, fight death with death. This sounds like dust and a lie in my mouth. Well, I've said it. Put it down.
He doubted himself. He had some crushing blows. I remember a particular day when he'd written 1933 was a bad year, or he'd started on it. And he hadn't had a novel published probably in 12, 14 years at that point, because he'd been trying to write films and television, and he was excited about the book, and he sent it off to the publisher, and he wasn't sleeping well, and he'd go to the mailbox every day, and finally the day came where he got his response. And basically it read something like, "Mr. Fante, you've lost your touch. That manuscript went in the file cabinet." And I don't think he tried to write a novel for maybe another 8 or 10 years after that.
He felt like a failure as a writer, and yet he knew he was a good writer. And the wonderful thing, toward the end of his life, the last 10 years of his life, he continued to write as an artist. He just continued to write. And that was what was an enormous and powerful example to me, because with everything else aside, with all the career considerations aside, his finest hour as an artist was continuing to write when there was no recognition, when there was nothing other than his own need, his own propulsion to create. And that was when he did his best work.
I'm always accused of forsaking my writing for the Hollywood glitter and gold. That I worked as a screenwriter is treated as if I'd had a bout with the clap. But who really gives a shit? I wrote Bandini because it was a boil that had to be lanced. Most of my short stories were smaller boils. Ask the Dust was a painful boil. It had to be bled and cleansed. Full of Life was written for money. It's not a very good novel. Meanwhile, I sit in my little dirty room sucking my thumb and trying to write a novel, and I'm calling it The Brotherhood of the Grape, the story of 4 old Italian wine drunks from Roseville, a tale revolving around my father and his friends. Have a nice summer. Love to Iris.
At the time I was living here, my other siblings had all moved out, so it was just myself, my mom, my dad. And he would come out and read chapters to us. And we loved it, you know. We encouraged him, and he kept writing. But while he was writing, he had his feet, he had ulcers on his feet from the effects of diabetes. So he would soak his feet in buckets of Epsom salts. Very, very painful situation. And he would write with his feet in these buckets, and you know, I'd go in and see him, and there he'd be, you know, suffering, but writing. Happy he was writing, but suffering. And then, of course, the diabetes progressed, and they amputated one leg, and then started on the other foot. He ended up having that amputated above the knee as well. And in the midst of all this, he started losing his eyesight.
Dear Carrie, the first great loss after a leg is the ability to write. It's like struggling with a heavy rubber tire hanging from your neck. My trouble is that I fell twice. I began to fool with a walker and stumbled backward, landing on my stump. Pain ever since. But being alive is worth something, and so you stick it out. Stay on your feet, Carrie. Don't fall. John.
I was a young man, starving and drinking and trying to be a writer. I did most of my reading at the downtown LA Public Library. I kept on walking around the big room, pulling the books off the shelves, reading a few lines, a few pages, then putting them back. And nothing that I read related to me, or to the streets, or to the people about me. Then one day I pulled a book down and opened it. The book was Ask the Dust, and the author was John Fante. And there, at last, was a man who was not afraid of emotion. The humor and the pain were intermixed with a superb simplicity. The beginning of that book was a wild and enormous miracle to me. Yes, Fante had a mighty effect upon me. Not long after reading this book, I began living with a woman. She was a worse drunk than I, and we had some violent arguments. And often I would scream at her, "Don't call me a son of a bitch. I am Bandini, Arturo Bandini."
When I was getting the manuscript of the novel Women by Charles Bukowski ready for publication, there was a very interesting little scene in the novel about Henry Chinaski, who was Charles Bukowski, reading in a bar in Hollywood, and afterward an English teacher came up to him with her class and asked for his autograph and to tell him that she thought he was one of the best writers in America. And Bukowski was pleased by that. And then she went on to ask him who his favorite writer was. And he said John Fante. And she'd never heard of John Fante, and neither had I. And she remarked that it would be strange that as an English teacher, she never would have heard of him. And Bukowski is rather curt with her about that, because she should know who he was. And later, after the book was published, a year or so, I was talking to Bukowski on the phone, and I, for some reason, thank goodness, I asked him about that scene, and I said, "There's no such person, is there?" And he said, "Of course there is." And I was really shocked. And it took me almost a year to get a copy of Ask the Dust. None of the libraries had it, no bookstores had it. It wasn't in print and hadn't been for 40 years. And I finally was able to get a Xerox copy of the book from the LA Public Library. And when I read it, I knew I had run across a classic. And at that time, Bukowski, and still to this day, but at that time, he was very big in Europe, in France and Germany and Italy. And so I asked him if he would write a preface to Ask the Dust, because I knew it would help with overseas sales, and I knew it would certainly help here in America. And then the book took off. I think that book was published around the early 80s, and in less than 20 years, I'm sure we've sold several 100,000 copies, and that many more in Europe in translation.
When he was rediscovered and began being republished by Black Sparrow Press, he was very happy. He, of course, was by that time a blind man and also a double amputee. But I took the new copy of Ask the Dust to him. He was in the motion picture hospital, and he held it in his hands, and I described it to him, and he was so happy. He couldn't have been happier.
Inexplicably, he pulled himself together for a period of time when he wrote Dreams from Bunker Hill. But I guess he had one more book to write. So he sat out here in the back with my mom and dictated it.
I think he composed in his head, and he had everything ready to put down on paper. Then he would dictate, and I had a legal tablet. Imagine it sitting in the patio now in the sunlight with the birds building their nests in the springtime. And he didn't hesitate very much when he dictated, because he had already gone over it in his mind. And I think in his own mind he was back in that period. He was a young man again, because it sounds like a book written by a young man.
So I was back again, back to L.A. with 2 suitcases and $17. I liked it. The sweep of blue skies, the sun in my face, the endearing streets, tempting, beckoning, the concrete and cobblestone, soft and comforting as old shoes. I rode on the trolley to the crest of Bunker Hill and looked at the hotel in the distance. It was magic, like a castle in a book of fairy tales. The manager of the Filipino hotel was glad to see me. It was no surprise when he said that my room was unoccupied. It was my kind of room. I deserved it. The smallest, most uninviting room in Los Angeles. I started up the stairs and pushed open the door to the dreadful hole. I felt better, no longer tired. I sat erect before the typewriter and blew in my fingers. Please, God, please, Newt Hampson, don't desert me now. I started to write and wrote, "The time has come," the walrus said, "to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax, of cabbages and kings." I looked at it and wet my lips. It wasn't mine, but what the hell? A man had to start someplace.
The final result of advanced diabetes is that your kidneys fail from lack of circulation. And they kept giving him this drug, and he was in a coma. And I was sitting with him for hours, and finally the nurse said to me, "Do you want to continue giving him that drug, that Lasix, to keep him alive?" And I thought about it, and his condition was irreversible. And I went out, I remember going out into the back of the hospital and being alone, and I came back, and I was standing with her in the doorway of his room, and I said, "No, you should stop the drug." And the moment I said that, his heart monitor went off just 2 feet away, and his heart stopped. The minute I said it, and I ran to his bed, and I yelled at him, I said, "Dad, breathe." And he began to breathe again. And then a minute or two later, he stopped breathing, and I yelled at him again, and he started breathing again. And the nurse finally, Mary, she put her hand on my hand, and she said, "Please, just let him go." So I was holding his hand when he died.
Ask the dust on the road. Ask the Joshua trees standing alone where the Mojave begins. Ask them about Camilla Lopez, and they will whisper her name. You will not believe that a girl would start across the Mojave Desert in October, but it happened. I saw Camilla's footprints in the sand. Let these hills hide her. Let her live with stones and sky, with the wind blowing her hair to the end. Let her go that way. I made my way up to the path to the ford. In the seat was a copy of my book, my first book. I opened it to the flyleaf and wrote, "To Camilla, with love, Arturo." I carried the book 100 yards into the desolation. With all my might, I threw it far out in the direction she had gone. Then I got into my car, started the engine, and drove back to Los Angeles.